Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about energy that we find in the environment, energy in ecosystems, and take a close look at food chains, food webs, the energy pyramid, and some also other energy resources. So to begin with, let's review vocabulary. You guys should be pretty familiar with this. We know that a producer is an organism that can make its own food. So this is basically plants, right? So our producer is plants, okay? And then we have our next one, which is, get there, a herbivore. A herbivore is an animal that eats only plants, okay? Cows being a herbivore, okay? Lots of different rabbits, for example, being herbivore, only eating plants, grasses. Carnivore are animals that only eat meat, okay? Lions and tigers, okay? Those are carnivores, eat only meat. Omnivore. An omnivore is an organism that eats both plants and animals. We are omnivores. We eat plants, we eat green, and we also eat meat. Okay, lots of other, we're not the only ones that are omnivores. Lots of other animals are omnivores. Bears, for example, are omnivores. They'll eat fish, but they'll also eat plants and berries and so forth. A decomposer is an organism that breaks down the remains of other dead organisms, worms and bacteria. Those are all fungus, those are all decomposers. So when an organism dies, whether it's a plant or animal, these other organisms come in and they cause that animal and that plant to decay and break down and return back to the soil. Okay, so let's talk about food chains. Okay, a food chain is something that shows how energy is passed through the environment, how energy is passed from one organism to the next. So here, for example, we have a food chain. Now, the beginning of the food chain starts with a plant, starts with a producer. Okay, all food chains start with a producer. Now, a producer, okay, producer, we call it a producer because it can make its own food. And then that energy is going to get passed on to a consumer. A consumer is an organism that has to eat, to take in its food. So here we have the example of the mouse being the consumer. Now notice this arrow right here. The arrow is going from the producer to the consumer, from the plant to the animal. A lot of people think that the arrow is telling us, you know, what eats what. Okay, now this doesn't make sense if you're talking about this example because the mouse does not eat. Okay, or excuse me, the plant, here we have the wheat, for example, does not eat the mouse. That doesn't make sense. Plants don't eat animals. Doesn't make sense. In this case, the mouse is eating the producer, the wheat, the plant. So all of that energy that is in that plant, all of the energy that's locked up in that plant gets transferred to the mouse. And thus we have the arrow going in that direction. Where is the energy going? It's going from the producer to the mouse. Now this mouse is the first in line of consumers. So we call it a primary. Remember that, first and primary, same thing. We call it a primary consumer. Now, when this snake here, okay, when this snake eats the mouse, all of the energy in that mouse goes to the snake. Okay, the energy is transferred from the mouse to the snake. The snake is getting its energy from the mouse. Okay, now this snake is second in line. Okay, so we call it a secondary consumer. So the mouse is first, so it's primary. The snake is second, so it's a secondary. And then lastly, we have the hawk. The hawk eats the snake. All of the energy from the snake is going to the hawk. Okay, the hawk is at the top of the food chain. Okay, nothing eats the hawk. It's the end of the line. Okay, so in that case, we call this a tertiary consumer. Tertiary. Now that's probably a new word for you. You've heard of producer and consumer, and probably primary consumer and secondary consumer, but tertiary. So here we have, okay, our producer, and then our primary consumer, secondary consumer, and there it is, our tertiary consumer right here. tertiary consumer. It's our top level consumer. Now, in some chains, you might have a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, a third level consumer. We wouldn't call it a third dairy, but a third level consumer, a fourth level consumer. You know, it can go on and on. But when we get to the end, the top level consumer, the last consumer in that food chain, is what we call a tertiary consumer. Okay? And all different food chains have a beginning point with a producer and an ending point with a tertiary consumer. Okay? Okay? All right, so let's go on and let's talk about a couple of other things. Producers, another name for a producer can also be an autotroph. Autotroph, we've talked about autotrophs before. Auto means they can make their own. Okay? Auto means own, okay, or self. Okay, autotroph, they can make their own food, and consumers are called heterotrophs, so those are kind of synonyms for producer and consumer. And then, when we take a bunch of overlapping food chains, we get what we call a food web. Okay, so there are all sorts of food chains out in the environment. Okay, all sorts of food chains out in the environment. You've got millions of food chains. And none of these food chains stick to themselves. You don't have a food chain over here and a food chain over here, and those food chains never cross paths. They do. They all cross paths. And when you take these food chains and they start overlapping, you get what we call a food web. So in this example, okay, I've got several food chains. I've got this one. For example, I've got the producer down here, which is our grass or our plants. And then we've got this rabbit that eats the grass, so all the energy in the grass goes to the rabbit. That's why we got the arrow going that way. And then that hawk eats the rabbit, so all the energy in that rabbit goes to the hawk. Okay? So there's one food chain. Then over here on the left, I've got a different food chain. I've got the producer, the grass, being the beginning of the food chain again. And when this little caterpillar here eats the grass, all the energy in the grass goes to the caterpillar. And then when the lizard eats the caterpillar, all the energy goes from the caterpillar to the lizard. And then when the hawk eats the lizard, all the energy goes from the lizard to the hawk. Okay? So that's another food chain that I've got going on there. Okay? So, but now you're going to start to see how these food chains are going to start to cross. I've got one here in the middle. All of the energy, okay, in the grass goes to the snail. All the energy in the snail goes to this little bird, and then all the energy in the little bird goes to the hawk. But then I start to see this cross, okay? I start to see arrows going different directions, and you start seeing different combinations, and that's where those food chains start to overlap, okay? All right, so let's go back here and take another look at some different examples. And for example, here is a Texas food web. Okay, here is a Texas food web. Now you're going to see we don't have a straight line of arrows. If we had a straight line of arrows, it would be a food chain. But in this case, I've got arrows going all different directions because I've got different food chains overlapping. You know, I could start off with a very simple food chain, being the for example, here being the, if I can get my pen to work, the algae, okay, being eaten by the fish being eaten by the alligator. Okay, so there's one food chain. But then I've got another food chain that starts off with, for example, this algae being eaten by the fish, but then the fish being eaten by the crayfish there, and then the crayfish being eaten by the alligator. So that's another food chain. And then up here at the top, I've got, you know, the leaves being eaten by the rabbit being eaten by the snake, and then the snake being eaten by the alligator. So you can start to see how I've got all these different food chains, but when they start to cross over and start to intermix, it becomes a food web. Okay, so let's answer some of these questions. Which of these are producers? Well, remember, our producers are the beginning of our food chains. They're the beginning of our food web, and those are our autotrophs. Those are our plants. So we would have leaves as being a producer, our algae as being a producer. Okay. Okay, forgot the sunflower over there, obviously. Which of these are primary consumers? Primary consumers. Primary consumers are the first consumers to eat the producers. Okay, they're the next in line. So what's eating the producer? Well, I can see that this arrow is going to this rabbit. Okay, so that's a primary consumer. I can see that this arrow is going to this cricket. The cricket's eating the leaves. That's a primary consumer. Okay, the butterfly eating the leaves. That's a primary consumer. Okay, the beetle eating the sunflower, primary consumer. Okay, again, the cricket eating the sunflower, primary consumer. I've got the fish eating the algae. That's a primary consumer. Okay, so all those consumers that eat producers, those are our primary consumers. Okay, and we can see that there. And then we're going to go on to which ones of these are secondary consumers. So secondary consumers are eating the primary consumers. So I've got, in this case, I've got, let's see, the bird eating the butterfly. Okay, I've got the frog eating the beetle. Okay, I've got the snake eating the rabbit. I've got the alligator eating the fish. I've got the crayfish eating the fish, and so forth. Okay, and we can see that by our circles there, the frog, the bird, the crawfish. Okay, and technically the alligator is not circled, but it could be because the alligator, okay, is eating the fish, so it would make the alligator a secondary consumer. And then lastly, we have the tertiary, the top level consumers. Okay, what are our tertiary consumers? Okay, the end of the line. Okay, and sometimes you'll see that, for example, this snake right here, he's considered a tertiary consumer in some food chains, but if he's in the food chain with the alligator, he's not. Okay, so it really kind of depends upon what the food chain they're in. But we have the snake, and then we have the alligator being our top level, our tertiary consumers. Okay, so this will do it for part 1 of this video, and we'll come back to part 2 next time and start talking about energy pyramids.